Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into this really powerful economic idea. It's the one that explains why some giant, unbeatable companies just vanish, while brand new ones seem to rise up out of nowhere. It's a force that shapes our entire economy, a constant storm right at the heart of capitalism. Okay, let's start with a scene I'm sure you remember. The ghost of the video rental store. You remember it, right? Walking down the aisles, the smell of popcorn, those dreaded late fees, and then, almost overnight, they were gone. Now, this wasn't just one company making a few bad decisions. No, a much larger, much more fundamental force was at play here. And the answer is a concept called creative destruction. It was famously described by the economist Joseph Schumpeter. You see, he saw capitalism not as some calm, predictable system, but as a perpetual gale of change, a process that is always destroying the old way of doing things to make way for the new.
And this process, it's really a two-sided coin. On the creative side, you get all the stuff we love, amazing new opportunities for innovators, better products, think streaming services, and, just more efficient ways of getting things done. But all that creativity comes with a price. That's the destructive side, where established companies lose their grip, old technologies become totally obsolete, and entire industries can just disappear.
So who was this brilliant mind who put his finger on such a powerful force? Well, let's meet the man behind the theory.
This guy right here is Joseph Schumpeter. He was born in Austria way back in 1883, and his ideas would completely change how we look at economic progress. He really shifted the focus away from just simple supply and demand to the wild, disruptive power of innovation.
And his journey was just incredible. His career wasn't spent locked away in some dusty library. He was a student at the London School of Economics, a professor at Columbia and Harvard, and for a little while, he was even Austria's Minister of Finance. And that mix of deep academic theory and real-world, high-stakes experience gave him this completely unique perspective on how economies actually work.
Okay, so what was the core problem that Schumpeter was trying to get at with this theory of his?
Well, you have to understand that traditional economics back then was kind of like a static photograph. It described the economy as being in this state of perfect balance, a circular flow where everything just neatly repeats itself. But Schumpeter knew that wasn't reality at all. He saw the economy for what it really was, a dynamic, kind of chaotic movie of constant change, all driven by radical innovations that don't just tweak the system, they completely destroy the old balance and create a brand new one. He put it perfectly himself. He argued that economists were way too focused on how capitalism manages the stuff that's already there. The real question, the relevant one, he said, is figuring out the process of how it creates and destroys those very structures in the first place. So, what powers this engine of change? Well, for Schumpeter, the answer was innovation. But his view on what drives innovation was, and honestly still is, super controversial. And he defined innovation really broadly. It wasn't just about new gadgets or gizmos. For him, it was all about the enforcement of new combinations. So anything from a new product to a more efficient way to produce something, to opening up a whole new market, or even just creating a new kind of company. Any of these could be the thing that disrupts the whole status quo. And this led him to ask this really provocative question, one that challenged the very core of economic thinking. For decades, the ideal was perfect competition, right? You have tons of small firms all competing like crazy. But Schumpeter asked, what if that's actually bad for fostering the big, risky innovations that really drive progress forward? He argued that monopolies, or at least the temporary market power they give you, are absolutely essential. Think about it this way. Why would a company spend billions on risky research and development if a competitor could just swoop in, copy the idea instantly, and sell it for cheaper? The promise of being the only one for a while, and raking in those monopoly profits, is the very incentive that drives that huge risk. Plus, these large firms can fund massive R&D projects and even have the power to set new industry standards. But of course, there's a really powerful counterargument. Without any rivals nipping at their heels, monopolies can just get lazy, fat and happy. They might not have much of an incentive to keep innovating. And let's be real, intense competitive pressure can be an incredibly powerful motivator in its own right. So yeah, this debate is far from settled. So the crucial point here is that the relationship is way more complex than just a simple yes or no. Modern research points to something called an inverted U-shape. What that suggests is that innovation is low when you have a pure monopoly, but it's also low when competition is so perfect that nobody can make a profit. The sweet spot, that peak of innovation, happens somewhere in the middle, in a market with fierce rivals, where making a breakthrough can still be really, really profitable. Now, what's really interesting is how this whole process of innovation doesn't just affect a single company here or there. Schumpeter argued it actually creates the great cycles of boom and bust for the entire economy. The cycle he laid out basically starts with an entrepreneur who introduces some radical new idea, and that leads to an economic upsurge. Then competitors see the success and they jump in, imitating and improving on the idea, which causes a huge economic boom. But eventually the market gets saturated, profits start to shrink, and the incentive to innovate kind of dries up, and that leads to a recession. That is, until the next big thing comes along.
And he even identified these different rhythms, or waves, in the process, all overlapping with each other. You've got these short kitchen cycles that are mostly about inventory. Then there are medium jugular cycles, driven by clusters of new products. And then you have the massive 40 to 60-year Contra-F waves, which are driven by those huge paradigm-shifting technologies, like the steam engine, the railroad, electricity, or of course the internet.
And all of this brings us to the key takeaway from Schumpeter's entire body of work. This process of creative destruction is relentless. It is ongoing, and it never, ever stops.
So Schumpeter's theory isn't just some dusty idea from a history book. It's a really powerful lens for looking at today and trying to see into the future. It forces us to ask a pretty tough question. Of today's dominant companies, the titans of tech, retail, and energy, which of these untouchable market leaders might be tomorrow's video store, completely swept away by a gale of innovation we can't even see yet? Maybe it's one driven by AI or quantum computing or some breakthrough we can't even name.
This explainer was based on a lecture from the Technical University of Berlin and other key academic sources on Schumpeter's work. Thank you so much for watching.